Here's part 2 of near-death experiences, real death experiences.
Ability to come back, but have or not have brain damage be down to pot luck, which is the way it is today. So in my opinion, if we put everything together, then the decision needs to be made before a person has died. In other words, if someone has a medical condition that cannot be cured and treated, let's say they have cancer that unfortunately has spread enormously, for which there is no treatment available today in 2013, then when their heart stops, we shouldn't even do the most basic forms of chest compressions at all. We should just stop because there's no hope. We could not eliminate the problem that caused them to die. However, there are many of us who will die of things that are reversible. Let's say someone who has an infection and it just takes them away before the antibiotics would work, or they have a car accident, or they have a heart attack, conditions that are essentially treatable by medical science today. Well, if we then implement all these higher standards of care, we can ensure that we can bring them back. So it's almost like we have to decide to give the right patients everything, and those of us who unfortunately cannot be cured of our ailments or have reached an age where we feel that we should be allowed to go, then I think we should respect that dignity and stop.
Hello now on RN Summer, and this is a chat with Dr. Sam Parnia about his book The Lazarus Effect and his extraordinary work on resuscitation. Now, let's go back to Joe Turolosi, because his case raised all the questions you'd been studying and was also the convergence of the two lines of investigation you're pursuing, resuscitation on the one hand and the fundamental mystery of human consciousness. Now, you interviewed Joe a few days after he awakened from the induced coma. What did he tell you?
Well, I actually found out about Joe Turolosi because the nurses who were taking care of him contacted me saying you must come and talk to him when he woke up in the coronary care unit when they took him out of his coma. Because they said he's had a profound experience and we don't feel equipped enough to talk to him about it. So when I spoke with him, it became very clear that he had indeed had a very profound experience. He described this enormous sense of relief, peace as he'd gone through his cardiac arrest, and that he'd met this being, a being of love that's full of compassion, that guided him through his experience. And this is not uncommon. A lot of people do describe a sensation of either seeing deceased relatives, almost who've come to welcome them, or seeing a being of light that guides them through. And sometimes they have an instantaneous panoramic review of their entire life. And what's fascinating is that many of them describe that they end up judging their own actions. So not only do they see what they do, but they actually feel what they did. So for instance, if someone had caused pain upon somebody else, even if it was by accident, it wasn't meant to be, they will still feel the discomfort that their actions had caused other people. So they themselves essentially judge. And then many of them, of course, go on to a place that they describe as being very beautiful, that they did not want to come back from, but for whatever reason and different reasons, they eventually come back.
Perhaps you weren't always doing them a favour with resuscitation. Okay, as I mentioned, I know 3 people who were dead for various lengths of time. None of them reported anything as amiable or pleasant as what you're describing, but I'm well aware that there are many, many hundreds of cases, and you've collected 500 yourself, of people who had what used to be called an NDE. You don't like the term. I think it's scientifically problematic.
If you look at the history of near-death experience, it's very interesting. As I mentioned, we discovered the system of CPR in 1960, and the first book that was published on near-death experiences came out in 1975. And it described, in essence, the experiences that people had had who'd been critically ill and who'd been brought back to life again, some of whom had had a cardiac arrest and actually gone beyond the threshold of death. However, the term near-death is very, very problematic because it's enormously vague. If you're studying something in science, you have to be precise. And in medicine, we have no such term as near death. You either die or you don't die or you're critically ill. And the conditions that make you be critically ill, whether it be meningitis, a gunshot wound, road traffic accident, different types of infections, heart attacks, cancer, whatever you may think of, their underlying biology is enormously different. And to clump everything together is highly problematic.
don't
And I
like
think
beer.
to a large extent that is what has caused a lot of the controversy and the debate, because people have put together things that are very different under one umbrella, and then they fight and they debate about them. So it's important to appreciate that the people that we study are those who've gone objectively beyond the threshold of death. We understand the biology of death very precisely. We know that as soon as the heart stops, even when you do CPR, that there is no brain activity within 2 to 20 seconds. Everything goes completely flat. The brain flatlines, everything flatlines. We then also understand, minute by minute, what happens to brain cells after a person has died, whether they receive CPR or whether they don't receive CPR. And so the biology becomes completely standardized, and that's why for those people who've gone beyond the threshold of death, I like to call their experiences an actual death experience.
Okay.
Because scientifically, we can now study them. We can compare them. We have no more fog. We have no more gray zone. So that's really that point. And if I may, I just want to address what you brought up earlier, right at the beginning of the conversation as well, about the people that you know who've had no experiences. Classically, we know that 10 to 20% of people who go beyond the threshold of death will come back with these incredible experiences, which are universal, have been described from all over the world, and they've been described in millions of people now. They're all over, from children less than 3 years old to any age that you can think of. The reason why the majority of people don't recall them is most likely because when a person's gone through death and we bring them back, the first thing that happens is their brain swells up enormously.
Less materialistic, less self-centered, less afraid of death. Okay. Talking about this decades ago, Susan Blackmore, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with, argued that what we might be dealing with is simply a process, effectively a mechanical shutdown, that these images, these sensations, might simply be the brain closing down.
Well, I think you've raised a number of very interesting issues there. First of all, I'm a big admirer of Susan Blackmore's work, and we go back many years, actually. In order to really put this into perspective, it's important to realize, again, what Susan Blackmore was talking about was this vague entity of near death, where people could be at different levels of illness and different stages, which is not the same as people who've had a cardiac arrest and gone beyond the threshold of death. In essence, after near-death experiences were described, a number of people tried to fit it into a scientific model. So, for instance, Susan Blackmore suggested that this may be due to a lack of oxygen affecting the brain that may be causing an illusion, at least in terms of the tunnel effect and seeing the light. And others came through with other opinions. Most of us who are involved in the field today in the 21st century from different parts of the world agree that actually those explanations were appropriate at the time, but are not supported by the evidence that's come through over the last couple of decades. For instance, we know that there's no relationship between oxygen and having these experiences. People have them under different circumstances. And there have been, of course, thousands of studies of the effect of oxygen in people. As you pointed out, I'm a critical care doctor, and almost every night that I'm on call, I deal with many patients who have low oxygen levels. And we don't see them having anything that resembles a near-death experience. So I think the general consensus, at least with those who are actively involved in the field, not those who are looking out from the periphery, is that this is a universal experience that we cannot account for using models such as oxygen, carbon dioxide drugs, because there is no supporting evidence for them.
Might it perhaps, and suddenly I'm putting on a Richard Dawkins cap, might it perhaps be an evolutionary development to make death less terrifying?
If I may, I'm going to focus on the patients who I study, which are those who've gone beyond the threshold of death. To explain this, it's, as I pointed out earlier, when a person has died, the brain shuts down within moments. And that's simply logical because there's no blood getting into the brain. When you then do CPR, even if you do great quality CPR, you cannot get enough blood into the brain to reactivate the circuits and generate any electrical activity. And we know that in order for the brain to communicate, you have to have electrical activity and communication between different parts of the brain, which become completely flat during the time of what we call a cardiac arrest, even with CPR. So at that time, there is no time for people to have any kind of psychological reaction. It's not like you have time to imagine you're about to die. This happens in an absolute instant. Your heart suddenly stops and you're gone. So it's very hard to imagine that this is something that's sort of evolving gradually. If you were looking at people perhaps in a hospice who are slowly dying, you might be able to put forward those kind of arguments. But there's very little evidence to suggest that. What we do know is that it appears that after a person has died, at least in the first period of death, in other words, the first few hours, that entity that we call consciousness, the thing that makes us aware, thinking beings, does not become annihilated. It simply hibernates. And we as the outsiders cannot see it. So to us, the person looks like they're completely unconscious. But actually, it does not become annihilated. And that's why we probably have reports of people who do claim to be able to see things, hear things, and accurately describe exactly what was happening in the rooms, conversations, clothing, etc.
This is the so-called out-of-the-body experience.
That's a term that's been used to describe this. Again, as far as I'm concerned, this is simply reports of awareness during resuscitation, which is what led to the AWARE study.
Well, in the time we've got left, can you talk to the AWARE study? AWARE is awareness during resuscitation.
You see, again, if we sort of take off, and this is one of the things I've tried to do in my work, is to demystify the concept of death and make it into a scientific entity and allow us to study it and understand it from that perspective. If you take away social perceptions and philosophical perceptions about death and just boil it down to science, when a person dies, as I said, brain activity ceases, but the cells inside the brain only start to undergo their own process of death at that time. Now, biologically speaking, there are parts of the brain that are involved with your conscious awareness. The fact that those of us who are talking or listening to the radio, we're fully awake and alert. That's because certain parts in the middle of our brain have numerous chemicals that are at a particular balance that keeps us awake. For instance, if you take a strong antihistamine, especially the older generation, histamine itself is involved with putting you to sleep or keeping you awake, depending on the levels, as are various other chemicals. So when a person dies, and I'll just explain a bit more, if you have a general anesthetic, for instance, those chemicals work on those areas of the brain and they switch off your consciousness. If you get a severe illness like liver failure and you have chemicals building up in your system, those chemicals will affect those parts of your brain that keep you awake and alert, and they put you into a sleep, and if it's deeper, you go into a coma. So when a person dies, biologically speaking, all that's happened is you've stopped delivering oxygen to those parts of the brain that keep a person awake and alert, and as a consequence, they go into a deep coma, like would occur with any other condition. Now, obviously, as time progresses, those cells involved in the structure of the brain will eventually start to go through their own process of death and will eventually decay to a point where you cannot get the person back. But that's why I explained that at the beginning of death, the evidence is that consciousness is not annihilated. It's very similar to what happens when you're given a general anesthetic, when you appear to be completely unconscious or in a coma, but it hasn't disappeared into thin air. There's something still there, and I think that's why they can recall what's going on.
At the same time as looking at your book, I've been rereading Oliver Sacks' latest on hallucinations, and Oliver's an old friend of the program, and there are certain overlaps between what he's coming up with or what he's reporting on in terms of what might be called altered states of consciousness and your studies of the brain and consciousness. Have there been any results yet to the overarching AWARE study that you can reveal?
Well, I've had a lot of inquiries about the AWARE study through the years. It's a completely new study, new type of study, I should say, because we're trying to essentially study consciousness and awareness in people who should have no brain activity, which obviously makes it very difficult. And unfortunately, for various reasons that are out of my control, many of these patients are not brought back to life. And as I explained earlier, those who are brought back, the majority of them have their memories wiped out, so it's hard. So I've tried to summarize the results at least up till the end of 2012 in the book. And in essence, yes, we've had people who've had awareness, not as many as we had hoped, because we've had fewer patients come back to life in order for us to interview them. And so the study, after 3 to 5 years of sort of going through a feasibility stage, we have taken on what we've learned and we're trying to adapt and change it and move on based upon the evidence that's been coming through.
Of course, Sigmund Freud had quite immense difficulties in trying to make sense out of dreams. It must be immensely difficult for you as a scientist to deal with ephemera like awareness experiences.
Well, consciousness itself is the biggest mystery probably in science. You know, what is it that makes us into who we are? Why am I a thinking, conscious being? Why do I seem to have the ability to make decisions for myself? And why do I have all types of emotions and rational thought and all the rest? And of course, this is not something that only we have been interested in. This goes back at least to the time of the great Greek philosophers, if not just before. And if you boil down, you know, in a very simplified way, the philosophical arguments that have now led on to science today, you find that there were two different sort of viewpoints. But in essence, what the Greeks referred to, and they called it the psyche, was what made a person who they were. Their psychological functions, their morality, their ethics, their emotions, etc. And then the word psyche was later translated into the word soul, into English. But at the time, the Greeks didn't necessarily believe that the psyche or the soul, or what we now call consciousness, was necessarily everlasting. Many of them, including Aristotle, believed that when you die, because the psyche, the soul, or consciousness is a product of bodily processes, when the body dies, that also dies. There were, however, others, such as Plato, who believed that actually psyche, soul, or consciousness is separate from the body and therefore continues to exist after we die.
Where do you stand on this, Sam?
I don't have any personal opinions because I've been thoroughly involved in this for so long. But what I can say is that for the first time, we are able to try to answer these questions through the objectivity of science. And if you look at the evidence that's coming through, it does suggest that we should at least consider the possibility that consciousness may continue when the brain does not function and the person's gone beyond the threshold of death, which, of course, if proven further, would support Plato's view rather than Aristotle's view.
Sam, thank you for this. Talking to Dr. Sam Paneer, a critical care doctor and director of resuscitation research at the Stony Brook University School of Medicine in New York. Sam's book, The Lazarus Effect, the science that is erasing the boundaries between life and death, and it's published here in Australia by Random House. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
There you go. As it happens, there's maybe half a minute, perhaps a minute and a half, missing in the middle of this second part of near-death experience equals real-death experience, the Lazarus effect. But, you know, that's what happens when you get a hillbilly hermit 5/6 pissed trying to make a movie. Occasionally some things go wrong, but I figure that the 17 odd minutes, got that ant, the 17 odd minutes that I did manage to record should give you the gist of it. The fact of the matter is, Phillip Adams, the celebrated Australian atheist, left-wing, ex-communist, ASIO had a file on him when he was 15, he was interviewing an intensive care specialist doctor who makes his living by taking brainwaves of people who are so sick that they may need to be resuscitated. So when they do get resuscitated, he's got smicky, pickety-boo, yahoo yippee type measurements of their blood chemistry and their cerebral electrical activity. And he says that 2 to 22 seconds after your heart stops, there is a complete shutdown. There is nothing that modern medical science can detect in terms of brain ability, yet he's talking about people who have maintained consciousness and a functional personality and have completely recovered after 4, 7, even 10 hours of being, quote, clinically dead. basically I would have to put all of my credibility, my faith, my belief in what he's finding and what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross found when she interviewed all those people who'd had near-death experiences. Just because somebody has an unconsciousness episode and they don't remember anything, that doesn't actually mean that nothing happened. What it means is they don't remember it. My own father in 1943 had his chest squashed when he was examining the engine of a tip-up truck, you know, like the entire tray, maybe 3 tons, was hydraulically elevated. He was looking at the engine behind the cab when one of the employees thought that the lever to release hydraulic pressure was actually a handhold to help oneself get into the cabin. So, yeah, my father got his chest squashed for several minutes in 1943. He always said that he didn't ever remember anything from it. But before that, he was kind of a bit of a go-getter. After that, he was deeply involved in public service organisations and trying to, you know, do good works, like, you know, find somebody who was struggling financially and go down to council and pay their rates anonymously. That sort of thing, you know, like he became committed to doing good works after he had, well, it was the sort of near-death experience where after they started the engine, raised the hydraulic pressure, lifted the tip-up truck off him so it was no longer crushing his chest, they pulled him out of there and put a bag over his head and called the doctor to write out a death certificate. And, you know, when the doctor showed up to write the death certificate, back in those days they had to hold a mirror over the person's face to see whether any condensation appeared on the mirror. And, you know, there was condensation, thus and because my father was breathing, therefore he didn't go to the morgue in 1943, and, you know, behold, I was born in 1961. Near-death experiences are real. The evidence is starting to come in, and people who want to believe that there is nothing past death, they keep desperately scrabbling at straws, you know. Oh, it's something to do with a deoxygenated brain. Well, you know, like, no, that has not been a viable hypothesis since the 1970s. Pretty much it's a case of, as Shakespeare said, there is more in heaven and earth than is dreamed of in your little philosophy, Horatio. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Sorry about the gap, but, you know, you'll get the gist. Ciao.